Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In the previous episode, we used multi-cellular life as an example of a software innovation within the living cell. We went back to the alternative view of the single cell as an eternal form, the eternal flame, and we traced that single cell through the act of fertilization and then the construction of an ordered, highly orchestrated colony in the form of the multi-cellular organism, the body, be that plant, animal, fungus. I've leaned heavily on the metaphors of software and cybernetics, computer and information systems theory, because we live in the information age. In previous ages, before the concepts like computer and machines that compute, perhaps the abacus could be a machine that compute that's quite ancient, but the modern conceptualizations of cybernetics, software might be seen from a different perspective. We could talk about it as spirit, as the animating force, the thing that leaves the body when the mind shuts down, the thing that creates the form from the matter. Going back to what we are now familiar with, we have computers that we can turn off, and when the software isn't running, it's simply an object. It doesn't have any internal animation. Physically, nothing has really changed other than perhaps the switch that enables power to flow through the circuits. The switches of the circuits in the transistors are largely ephemeral, and there is a very good correlation between the concept of spirit and the concept of software. It's the same phenomenon seen with a different framing, a different language. Living systems have always exhibited mysterious behaviors. I'm not sure if it's true, but it was thought that mice were generated from piles of rags left in dark corners. It's a good urban myth, even if that isn't true. The mystery of the origin of disease before microbes and pathogens were discovered. And again, the mystery of life and death, where the body simply loses something when we die, the animating spirit. It's like turning off the power to a computer or a machine, like a robot. The machine still exists, but something has changed, something has left. I know this touches on religion and religious themes. I'm not discounting the fact that there might be something beyond this world. In fact, as we move deeper into systems philosophy, it will touch upon scientific ideas like simulation theory. And once you accept that we might be living in a simulation, then anyone who has played a computer game will realize that the simulation can create rules, but those rules could very well hide what's beneath it. The physics engine sets the boundaries for reality, and yet the character in the computer exists within a virtual world that is embedded within our real or possibly virtual reality. That's just a few ideas to give you mental flexibility in how you view situations. When I think of animal spirits, I think of the North American indigenous people, the spirit of the buffalo, for instance, being a name to the buffalo species, the form that continuously re-emerges from the ether, from I don't even know what name the Native Americans gave to the immaterial world. In Abrahamic religions, we have the moulding of clay into the human form, recognizing that the soil of the earth brings forth the living forms of the food that we eat. From ashes to ashes, from dust to dust, talks about the way that the form is created, inhabited by the spirit, and then returned back to the basic building blocks, the atomic and elemental constituents, the chemical compounds, the residue that is left when the spirit leaves. The spirit of the buffalo could be also seen as the gene pool or the species. Individual buffalo lives come and go and feed certain Native Americans, which provides the sort of tight reflexive coupling that I've been continuously referring to. The spirit of a particular tribe can be linked very closely to the spirit of its food source in this reflexive coupling, just like the fox and the rabbit, or the buffalo and the grass, the prairies. You can see the dynamics in terms of couplings. And I think that the ancient peoples did have an inkling of the sort of systems dynamics that I'm talking about. The spirit of the buffalo is the species, is the herd, is the ability for individuals to live and die in their lives. And for the cornucopia, there's another concept you can perhaps look into. It is this concept of living systems providing infinite abundance. It has the symbol of a horn or a cone from which the abundance of life flows. It's the cornucopia is an object and it's also a concept. The species is such a concept. The species interacts with ecological dynamics and keeps budding forth individuals and individual lifetimes, which you can then, as a predator, hunt and subsist upon. I thought that might be a nice set of framings from which to expand yesterday's concepts. Another framing that we introduced yesterday is the lifespan, the immortal flame of the living cell that divides and is extinguished within individuals and yet burns on within the biosphere is a perspective that I like to keep personally, and it stands in contrast to the individual lifespans of bacteria between divisions. Just as a reminder, we can see the individual cells, and bacteria is just a placeholder for single-celled organisms, common things that are well studied and still exist all around us in our environment. There's many others, but I'll use bacteria just as a touchstone. So a bacteria cell is alive, and then it divides, and we consider that life ended and two daughters born. That way we can track generations, and generations are useful because they track population dynamics, but it's only one framing. From another point of view, the flame has jumped from one wick to another. It has simply made a copy of itself, like a Star Trek replicator, transporter. I covered that in some of my early episodes. The individual life from that perspective is a fitness test of the gene pool. The gene pool itself is an abstraction of the genetic diversity held within a group of single-cell replicators that cycle from fertilized egg through body back to fertilized egg, preserving the single-cell lineage within the female line and transporting the genetic material, but losing the cell structural components within the male line, dividing and recombining the chromosomes in a gene swap dynamic that is common to all life that reproduces sexually. That has been a large innovation and a modularization and encapsulation of certain genetic information that is then shuffled as chromosomes instead of relying only on random mutation or in the form of bacteria and microbes from studies into microbial tolerance to the biocides, the antimicrobials like penicillin that we invented and pesticides. We found that stressed bacteria actually deliberately excrete more genetic components and increase their rate of mutation, which takes me back to the concept of life as a living search algorithm that through form and function, through software and hardware, as a von Neumann replicator, seeks to improve its odds of survival through the simple process of fitness testing. You need to replicate, you need to survive long enough to be able to replicate, and that's pretty much the basis of evolution. Everything else is detail. We start from the concept of individual cellular replicators, searching the space for billions of years before they discovered things like multiple cell lines embedded within a single cell, the chloroplast and the mitochondria embedded within the greater cell, and the cell itself developing structure like organelles, the nucleus, for instance. We then have the invention of the multi-cellular organism, a structured growth of a colony that is cloned and relies on faithful replication and adherence to the program. Any cells that don't adhere to the whole body plan program we call cancer. They're cells that do their own thing. There's all sorts of philosophy and details about how and why cancer occurs, but from the level we're looking at, cancerous cells no longer obey the overall body plan, the software of the whole, and try to do their own thing, which can destroy the integrity of the whole and ultimately lead to death, which is the breakdown of the information field that maintains the body's integrity, the dynamic equilibrium. This brings me to the concept of lifespans and death. If we think of the von Neumann living replicator as undergoing a search algorithm, ever searching for better fitness, better adaptability to the environment, both living and physical, including physics itself, climate, all the solar cycles of night and day, year, season, and including greater solar cycles like Miyagi events, where the sun activity throws out superflares that can themselves affect the living environment. I won't go deeply into that right now. What we have is we have the possibility for different search efficiency. I've already talked upon the number of offspring. You can have many offspring that you put very little of your own biomass into if you're a female. And on top of that, you also can put very little of your time in terms of care and upbringing. That's a raw search algorithm that's based on physical form and leaves the eggs to hatch and to do their own thing, like most insects, many fish, and microbes, etc. You can also start to concentrate more biomass into each individual eggs and yet still produce a multiple, like turtles, for instance, instead of producing thousands or millions of eggs, or reptiles in general, they produce a clutch. The clutch is often buried somewhere. Sometimes the clutch is protected through territorial behavior, like the crocodile example I used, and my specific biology isn't good enough to give you many more examples of that. So you have examples of the female investing more in each individual egg, which means the embryo can develop to a higher stage of maturity before hatching, improving its survival chances. And the multicellular organism makes that possible. It also means you can start to invest time that you might spend on your own survival and producing more biomass for more eggs, in ensuring that the eggs you've already invested in are not predated before they're hatched. So that's one way that the search algorithm dynamic has changed form of living multicellular organisms and also changed the numbers of offspring. Another dynamic can be the lifespan. If we consider the gene pool as being an evolving, adapting repository of chromosomes, of genetic material that is held within living beings, then the frequency of each chromosome changes every time there is death within the population and every time we have a successful reproduction. Long lifespans mean that certain successful individuals act as anchors, especially males, where the genetic material of the male continues to be re-injected back into the population. And if you had an infinite lifespan, and some populations like sharks and some reptiles have very long lives compared to the time it takes to maturity, and that way the gene pool has anchors that help stabilize the genetic variability. The females can breed, live and die quickly if you like, and carry the variable side of things. The males can live long and anchor and spread successful genes through many females. That's not to say that females can't be long-lived and create like a double anchor pair. In populations that are shorter lived, things like mice and rabbits, the opposite dynamic happens. They can breed up very quickly to match food supply, but they can also vary their genetics very quickly to match genotype to the available food distribution. Rare genes will still persist, especially if they're recessive, but they might not predominate during a certain period where one type of food source is abundant. The population being able to quickly adapt by, for instance, favouring individuals who can metabolize toxins from a certain plant food source means that the gene pool itself drifts faster, but the population dynamics adapts even more quickly and can make use of the abundance. This dynamic means that an intelligent software search algorithm will use life and death just like it uses the number of offspring. So the lifespan is a tunable parameter for the search algorithm. Death is not an accident in multicellular organism. There may be other mechanisms that limit lifespan in terms of the evolutionary search dynamics perspective. It becomes obvious to me that lifespan affects the way that the gene pool and individual gene frequency shifts within a population and therefore necessarily will be selected for in the meta selection of population dynamics and health. The population of one rodent that is short-lived, which has a very similar ecological niche to a rodent that is long-lived, will be tested by the ecological dynamics of the seasons and seasonal variability, which affects abundance of various species. So the logic and rationale of that is clear. I thought that is something that is not talked about very often. The fact that lifespan itself is something that genetics will fine-tune as part of the ongoing dynamic equilibrium between individuals, the species, the ecology, and the physical environment. I think that is a lot that I've covered today. So I'll finish by just saying that all of this takes the perspective of software being expressed in the single cell, which is the fundamental unit, the von Neumann replicator. So all the various forms of the multicellular species and the single-celled dynamics that we see around us in this marvelous ecology are simply spirits, software expression that alter the form that the nanomachinery of the single cell can produce as it feeds and replicates, either as free individuals, as colonies of microbes, or as highly orchestrated sexually reproducing events that still follow the simple pattern of grow and divide, only this time for a time splitting into male and female before they refertilize and split again. The act of fertilization is an act of potentiation where the male and female, like Schrodinger's quantum cat, exist in both suppositions, and one or the other is the outcome. This is systems philosophy. Thank you for listening.